right, so let's go ahead and get started. I would like to welcome our speakers today. We have Dr. Felix Ankel. Dr. Ankel is a professor of emergency medicine at the University of Minnesota Medical School and medical director of health professions education at Health Partners Institute. He is also a former residency program director at Regents Hospital. Dr. Ankel has served as an ABEM board member since 2018. He currently serves as chair of the ABEM Continuing Certification Committee and vice chair of the Academic Affairs Committee. We are also joined by Dr. Wallace Carter. Dr. Carter is a senior associate medical director of EMS at New York Presbyterian and professor of emergency medicine and vice chair of clinical and faculty affairs for the Department of Emergency Medicine at Weill Cornell Medicine. He is also a former residency program director at New York Presbyterian. Dr. Carter has served as a member of the ABEM Board of Directors since 2016. He is chair of the Academic Affairs Committee and co-chair of our Stakeholder Advisory Committee. Dr. Ankel and Dr. Carter, thank you for joining us today.
Great, thank you.
So, good afternoon. I want to go, Felix? You want to start?
Yeah. Again, it's really would like to thank you for the time here and the opportunity to speak a little bit about the in-training exam. I think today we just wanted to have a short conversation about the in-training, about the scoring, and how to use the scores in your program, and ultimately have a lot of questions and answers.
Thanks, Felix. So I think this is, I think Felix and I will both agree, having been program directors for a period of time, a long period of time, this was one of those things that we used, and I think over the years it's been moved around, but it's certainly a moment of incredible focus for programs. I know residents think about it throughout the year, and they think about what it's used for and what it's not supposed to be used for. So I think we want to talk about is the ITE is one of those things that has been the staple, kind of a cornerstone of emergency medicine. We have been using the ITE for almost as long as the specialty has been around, along with our certification process, and we found that it has been an incredibly useful tool for us in terms of gauging residents' progress. So what is the ITE? The ITE has gone through, there's a lot of urban myth and legend around it, but what actually is the ITE? It's simple. The ITE is used by the American Board of Emergency Medicine to provide an estimate to the resident and the program director of one thing and one thing only. What is your ability to pass the qualifying exam on your first pass? I think that's very important for us to keep in mind. And I think that's one of the cornerstones. You may hear this, you'll probably hear that statement more than once during our presentation, and that's purposeful because we want to make very, very clear that while there may be other boards that use their in-training exams for different purposes, ours is pretty straightforward. We look to target knowledge and experience of a expected EM3 resident. We're not trying to use it to look at program evaluation and how's the program doing, and they should definitely never be used to compare program to program. This is an individualized experience between the resident and the American Board of Emergency Medicine, and helping them to prepare for their certification process, which will occur when they graduate. So that's kind of a little bit of the background. It is one of the things that we have tremendous experience with, and something that has, we think, a very valuable product for the resident and the program director and the specialty in general. Felix?
Yeah, so how is it developed? It's really, the questions are developed from the model of the clinical practice of emergency medicine, which has a breadth and depth of topics that the board feels that graduating emergency physicians should know. So if it's in the model of the clinical practice of emergency medicine, which is published every few years, that's on the ABEM website, it's fair game to be on the exam. If it's not, and sometimes some of these emerging conditions or technologies are not on in the model, it's probably not going to be on the model. The items, they're written by practicing emergency physicians that are active in their practice. They're trained to write the items. The items are all field tested, making sure they're reliable and valid and fair and relevant, with feedback loops to really pull the questions that are not on that. Next slide. So about the scores, Wally mentioned there's no passing score. It's really a predictive piece of data based on how you do on the in-training exam, gives you sort of a percentage chance of passing the qualifying or the written exam. The residents, they get detailed information about how they did, what areas they did very well in, areas they didn't do well in. The score is really the total items correct divided by the total numbers of the score items, and then there's some sort of equator type stats to make sure that the difficulty exam is similar to previous years. But program directors will get the scores on the individuals, and will get sort of the aggregate scores by topic area of how they did within the model of the clinical practice of emergency medicine. Wally?
So, as we said, we talk about what do we want to do with the exam, and the question is, how are we so confident that we think that the in-training exam is able to predict your first-time pass rate on the ABEM for qualifying exam when they graduate on the written exam? It's experience. I mean, we have, as I said, we've been doing this for a very long time. I think we're approaching 40 years, and ABEM spends a tremendous amount of time, money, and energy on making sure that our exam process is evaluated and collated and researched, and most importantly, disseminated amongst the emergency medicine community through publications. But essentially, we've done extensive research over the years, and if you're not aware of it, ABEM employs multiple psychometricians who are guiding us through the process. So we have great item writers, but it's psychometrically very highly validated. And essentially, we've looked at research over the years, or many years of research, and we've taken a look at how they've done on the ITE, and we've put it on a graph, and we've taken a look at how people have done on the qualifying exam, and looked at it over years, year over year over year. We have come to know now that there's little doubt in our mind that this is a useful tool, and it allows you to be able to sit with your residents and look at their ITE scores and be able to give them an idea of how they're going to do. And this is done by taking a look at multiple years, multiple generations, if you will, of scores, and see how you do as a resident. And again, it's based on the EM3 resident, but we try to break them out to give you scores as well for you if you are a 1 to 4 program. So the idea is that this is a single tool to allow residents, as they get close to getting ready to graduate, and again, as Felix said, using that detailed report of trying to figure out what they're going to have to work on a little bit and where their areas of strength are, and allow them to prepare and successfully challenge the qualifying exam. The results of the analysis, we show up in your residence report, and they can be used to basically have a conversation with the resident. They're meant to give them nothing more than their probability. And while the models are tailored, we try to give models that look to every program director, no matter what format you're using, to be able to have this conversation. And most importantly, the very reassuring news that I always had as a program director was that the residents did well for the most part. And I think when you have that conversation with a resident that is doing well, it is very reassuring to them that they're on track, that they're doing the things that they're being asked to do. But I think it's also very helpful and very therapeutic for residents that are struggling to be able to have an insight into what they can look forward to when they graduate and they sit for the ITE exam. So I think it's beneficial and therapeutic for all of our trainees and all of our program directors. Next slide. So the inappropriate use of scores, and it's not so much that it's inappropriate or incorrect or wrong or dangerous, but what we're trying to do is we're trying to have individual therapeutic conversations, if you will. And while we're giving you a summative score, the idea is it's really meant to be formative data. It's really meant to be able to help your residents focus and hone in on areas that they would like to be a little bit stronger in. What it's not meant to do is it's not meant to be able to use in your recruiting efforts to say, gee, we did this, or we did that, or the program across town did this, or the program, we are therefore a better program. That's clearly an inappropriate use of what we're trying to accomplish here. We're trying to have that conversation, and we're not in the business of being involved in ranking training programs. And we don't believe that ranking resident programs is in the best interest of specialty. We all know each program has its own individual identity and personality. And the programs that do the best, and the trainees that do the best, work the hardest to be able to fit their personality needs and their aspirations to which program is going to best be able to offer that area of educational kind of safe haven. But it's not meant to be able to say we have programs 1 to 282. I think that would be the complete and total opposite intent of what we're trying to do here. We're not trying to be like the other boards, which have used it in a very negative and somewhat punitive manner. We very much want to be able to have our graduating residents, when they take that ITE in that last February of their last year, to be able to look back and say, gee, I've learned a lot. There's still things for me to learn, but most importantly, I'm being set up for success, and I'm being given a very helpful tool to get me to the next level, to be able to pass the first part of our certification process, and do it. Hopefully, there's no way we can avoid the stress that comes with a qualifying exam, but hopefully they'll walk into it feeling that they have been partnered with by ABEM and feel that we are very much, while we are the certifying body, we very much are partners, and we want them to do well. And it's good for the specialty, it's good for the program. So that is really a little bit about the kind of the inappropriate use of the scores, which I think thankfully is not something that, well, it happens occasionally, not something that we see with most of our program directors. Next.
Yeah, just to add on what Wally said, just practically when I was a program director, learning data is really data and context, and the best context from my point of view is over time. So I found the ITE results most helpful over time to see how a resident was doing as an individual, and then also how we as a program are doing. Are there certain areas that we're starting to slip, let's say cardiology or endocrine, and others were doing well? And so to really look and make sure we're still educating on all the core areas of the model, the clinical practice of emergency medicine. But we did not use it as a promotion tool, like you need a certain score to go from PGY 1 or 2. I mean, that's what the CCC is for. That may be one piece of data, but it shouldn't be used as that. Or even things like permission to moonlight and all that. This is not what the in training has been really designed to do. It's simply, hopefully, as Wally would say, is a piece of data for program directors and learners and residents to have a conversation in terms of what to do to make them the best emergency physician that they can be. So the next ITE, March 2024, from February to March, so it's a period of days. Put those on your calendar. Next slide. Probably the meat of this webinar was to see if there's any questions, either now or later. I think we're open. I would love to hear. My first question is to Wally, how he practically used the ITE in his program.
So I used it as a tool, as pretty much as Felix has mentioned. Our residents were, again, when you come through medical school, there's always that. I get ready for the test, I prep for the test, and I tried to get the residents to understand that this is different than step 1. This is different than the MCATs. This is different than any of these other tests where you're going to be ranked and your future to move forward is going to be mandated or going to be assessed by a single tool. I really tried to work hard with the residents and the faculty to underscore the fact that this was therapeutic and this was helpful. And that's why, I always resisted, and we always would get the occasional phone call from the DIO or from, somebody within the institution or some of the faculty. Well, how did we do on the in-training exam? Did we do better than the program across town? Or, and I was like, well, I don't know. But I don't really care because that's not my concern. I really wanted to use the ITE as a learning tool for the residents to understand that they were in control of their own, they were adult learners, and they needed to be able to take from within the environment lots of different pieces of data. And whether it was an in-training exam or, how they did on a sim a couple of weeks ago or how they did on the shift before, that they needed to take control of their learning environment and use every piece of data that was available to help formulate themselves into the best practicing emergency physician that they could. So I tried very hard to unload it and have very little, if you will, I didn't want to make it a 10,000 volt wire that they were afraid to touch. I wanted them to take a look at the ABEM exam as like, man, I get to sit down for a morning. I get to drink a lot of coffee, and I get to answer a lot of questions that are going to help me unlock some of the mysteries of where I am as a learner. So that's what I did. I wanted it to be totally seen as something that they looked forward to. And again, it was always, I can't say I achieved that goal, but I didn't want them to walk in there saying, oh my gosh, my future, my career, and how my program views me is going to be decided upon how I do on this morning or afternoon when I'm filling out these questions online.
So online, we got a question. Would you recommend a percentage to pass or the median, et cetera, for performance plan? Has there been any studies on that? I'm not aware of any studies. I can tell you as a program director, what used to did was the first year as an intern, if there's someone 25% or below, we just put it on the radar screen. And I would say about most did well the next year. If it was the next year, one of the things personally I did was, is this a knowledge issue? Or is this a test taking issue? Is this sort of a form fruit of some kind of a test taking issue, and see if there was any past history of test performance. And if that was sort of ruled out, kind of had a plan of having other resources to really work with the resident to make sure that the in-service scores would go to a range where there's a high likelihood of passing the written or the qualifying exam. I don't know, Wally, if you had a cutoff on when to kind of intervene with a sort of
we didn't have we didn't have a hardwired number, but I will tell you, I think we were very fortunate. We saw years ago before the ACGME mandated having a clinical competency committee. We had a clinical competency committee for many years before, and one of the things that we did was we always took a look at it as a single point of information, and we looked at it in the aggregate. As Felix said, what you really want to do is you really want to take a look at the score and decide whether this is really an issue around test taking. Because if it is an issue around test taking, and again, what's interesting is as people evolve, even though they might have blown the USMLE out of the water, they've blown the MCATs. Test taking anxieties and test taking challenges can occur later in life. Not if you're good at it, you'll always be good at it. You can. I had a resident who was a great test taker. Something happened in medical school where I don't know, but this was a real challenge for the resident, and we realized after working with the CCC that this resident knew a tremendous amount, but there was something that happened when. In the good old days, a bubble sheet, a number 2 pencil came out, which we no longer use, but you know what I'm talking about. And we work with the resident, not so much on their knowledge content, but on work method. And I think that is really, as Felix said, that's really what this is about. Using it as kind of a diagnostic tool. And the one thing we did what we did was when we had a resident who we thought had an issue, or we thought that they were kind of a little bit further down than we would like them to be, the question was we sit down with them and say, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to write a prescription but you're going to write the first draft of the prescription. And kind of shifted it to them to say, okay, we need you to do a much deeper analysis of your learning environment. And we need you to be honest with us and be honest with yourself. Is this gee, I probably do have a data issue because, quite frankly, maybe I'm just not reading enough, and maybe I'm just not analyzing enough and asking enough questions. But we always made sure that it was owned by the resident to help them, and then to work with the faculty to help them develop these prescriptions going forward, because we all know that as we go forward in our practice, as emergency medicine grows, whether you're 10 years in the specialty or 20 years in the specialty, there's new things that come up every day, and you have to be able to figure out a way to become an effective lifelong learner. And I think we used it as kind of the first step in being a lifelong learner, with the idea being that the QE is important. I mean, it matters. Board certification is critically important. We know that on so many different levels. It's expensive. In many cases, you have to go someplace to take it. It's viewed by employers and stuff. So we wanted to make sure that while we wanted to decouple that, we also, most importantly, wanted to use it therapeutically for their education.
I think the one thing that bears mentioning is really the exam scores are released to the resident and the program director. They're not released to anybody else other than them for that. I really need the permission of both. And just Wally mentioned a little bit about diagnosis. When we diagnose things in the clinical arena, we do a history and physical, maybe we get a chest x-ray and a blood count and all that. Again, the ITE is one element of data gathering before we do sort of a diagnosis in terms of medical knowledge on that.
Now, I think that's a really critically important point. I mean, unfortunately, we're in an environment where, the certifying, the outside, the external agencies and the credentialing bodies and the medical staff offices and these companies are asking for increasingly larger amounts of what is really personally protected information. It's not uncommon now that we're getting all these requests. I need the procedure logs. I need how many this they did. There's a real understanding that there is a veil around the learning environment that is a kind of a bit of a canonical agreement between you and your learner to make sure that those data points are protected. The idea, if that were ever to happen where residents and students started to feel that this was no longer a safe place to learn, that this wasn't a place to ask questions, this wasn't a place to have the slip and fall, but help them get back up on the horse and keep moving forward. If that were ever to happen, it would be poison to what we're trying to do here. So please be very, very careful that when you get those kind of requests, that you think about them in the grander context of the relationship that you want to have, you have to have with your residents in order to be able to maintain that environment.
So there's a question about any consideration of a version of the in-training for oral boards. Would a sort of a residency, national residency, I would say, for lack of a better word, a mock oral boards. So great question. The oral boards, putting them on is actually a tremendous lift in terms of the tech, the cost of that. So there hasn't been a discussion of that. I can tell you, however, that we're doing a lot of work. I mean, ABEM is really wanting to make sure that we continue to say we have the highest standard in emergency medicine in terms of certification. And part of that is actually looking at initial certification. If you look at the ABEM web page and look at the Becoming Certified Task Force, really looking at what we're assessing and how we're doing. And part of that discussion is how do we work with residencies to see how we can provide the most value to make sure that the independent assessments are of the highest value. So not a lot of technical discussions in terms of doing that, not because that it wouldn't be a great idea. Yeah, I think just getting it done within residencies may be prohibitive in terms of cost and work, but great question. I don't know,
Although-
Walt, if you have any
Although I
opinions on
think
that?
that, you know, I mean, I think the standard in most programs, at least from my experience, has been that most programs do some form of oral board testing or oral board evaluation of their residents, not oral board testing. And I will tell you that I found that to be, in our program, an incredibly high yield process for us, because it allowed us to, again, get another data point, but it also allowed us to, you know, as opposed to, you know, not that, you know, the ABEM tries very hard in how we write questions and how we think about questions, is to avoid the stock questions that, you know, all the above, none of the above, those are verboten. We try not to, when we do our item writer workshop every year and we get our item writers together who are dedicated to the in-training exam, we try very hard to make sure those questions aren't asked. We try to ask questions that actually get to the meat of the matter. Does the test taker actually know the answer, or are they just guessing, or are they just good? They did Kaplan and Princeton and they're great test takers. But I found that doing the oral board preparation was a great time for us to not only get the resident comfortable with being in a totally, if you will, artificial environment, a little different than what they're used to with sim, but it was also a great opportunity for us as educators to be able to take the resident and push the resident a little bit to say, okay, well, you got the right drug and you got the right dose, but you know why? And if that didn't work, most importantly, what's your you know, bailout program? What's your fail safe? So I think that I don't know that ABEM really has the ability to kind of delve into that area, probably not for all the reasons that Felix just talked about, but I would strongly suggest, based on my personal experience and from speaking to a lot of my colleagues, that programs need to, as best they can, come up with oral board preparation or oral testing, not so much to be able to say, when I come in, I'm going to ace the exam because I'm going to know what happens in the oral board. That's not acceptable, but to be able to get the resident to be able to get comfortable with the environment, but then also to use it in a really useful educational way. You can ask questions in that area around communication, around team training, around task training, about complications that you can't ask on a written test, which is one of the reasons why when we come to the residency visit programs, we spend a fair amount of time talking about what are we trying to get out of the oral certification versus the qualifying exam. And we're looking at two very different bodies of knowledge. And I think, you know, I think that as program directors, we needed to try to make sure that we were questing for the same thing during our training programs.
I think the one thing that in training, I view assessment almost in sort of three phases. There's self-assessment, and there's truly some limitations with that. If it was only about self-assessment, we would kind of read on things we don't know about and do that. And then there's workplace assessments, which are important, which residencies and all that. And then there's sort of these national independent assessments. So the ITE hopefully helps support self-assessment and workplace assessments, because all of the assessments have some kind of a distortion. And just like self-assessment can have some distortion, workplace assessments can have some distortion. We looked at actually combining with other residencies to do oral boards to kind of decrease a little bit potential for distortion for workplace assessments, so that we you know, some of our subconscious inherent biases of maybe residents we'd like more may score better on communication, but if you really look at communication based on communication, maybe shouldn't be scored as high. So I think, again, the whole idea of a national sort of in training type for oral boards is a great idea. I don't think it's in the ABEM part of the discussions, at least for the next couple of years. But I highly recommend mock oral boards. And if you could do it with other programs, it kind of takes away potentially some of the distortion of workplace assessments.
Felix, that's a great idea. I was just thinking back. I mean, I don't think they do it anymore, but there was a period of time I remember, speaking to the folks in Chicago, they had if I remember correctly, if I remember Steve telling me correctly from Cook County, they had an oral board day or two on a Wednesday usually. And what they would do is they would shuttle their residents around the city to other programs. That's harder if you're in an environment where you're kind of one or two programs, but there's still ability now with Zoom. There's definitely an easier ability to do, but they actually physically move their residents around the city to do that exact same thing, which the idea was also, as Felix said, workplace distortion, but also to get the resident comfortable with being asked questions by a total stranger, which is a little part of the anxiety that comes along with the oral board. So I think with a little bit of creativity and kind of collaboration with your colleagues in your area, in your region, that you can come up with some really thoughtful, crafted, forward-thinking processes to get through the oral certification process.
Great. I'm just looking if there's any questions. Time has flown. We're a half an hour into it. Again, I think I'm going to speak for Wally also. If we're happy to discuss this offline for anybody that has any questions on that. Thank you again for taking the time to be on this webinar. AJ, I don't know if you have anything, or Wally, any final words?
No, thank you. Thank you. Listen, I think Felix and I know this so well. One of the greatest gifts that a program director can give you is time. So we really thank you on behalf of ourselves as your colleagues and coming from ABEM, but most importantly as your EM colleagues. And we are both program directors in recovery, so we get it, we understand, and we just want you to know how grateful we are that you took the time out of your schedule to talk with us. And as Felix said, absolutely happy, especially we know there are 280 programs out there now, lots of new program directors. Sometimes if you feel a little isolated, we hope you don't feel isolated because it's an incredible community. So please feel free on behalf of Felix and I to reach out to us. And if we can help you kind of get over some of the rough spots, feel free. This is all about information sharing and continuing to make emergency medicine the great specialty that it is.